for that very kind introduction. The one thing you failed to mention is that I graduated from Yale many, many years ago. Actually, before the title of this lecture. It's great to be here today, and I'm glad that all of you have turned out on a wintry day here in Eurasia. We're learning about the United Nations, how it functions, and I thought that I would organize my remarks today around the topic of war and peace, which is a fundamental function for the United Nations. War and peace, as we know, is a central issue in global affairs. No decision bears greater consequences for world leaders than the decision to go to war. And no challenge is greater than establishing and enduring peace after a bit of conflict. A period of transition, a time when it is quite possible that a major war will erupt, is also something that is on our minds as one world order gives way to the next. In fact, history would suggest that war, a major war, is the midway of a new world order. We think of the Napoleonic Wars of the 18th and 19th century, the two world wars of the 20th century. We are living now in a time of transition. Great power conflict has reemerged. We think of the conflict in Ukraine, which Russia sees as an existential threat to itself emanating from the West. The rise of China, the tensions that we see mounting between the United States and China over Taiwan. We can add to that the current conflict in the Middle East, starting out between Israel and Gaza, but today on the verge of expanding to other territories in that part of the world. So, we have great power competition reemerging, and at the same time, what we're witnessing, I would argue, is a deterioration in the authority of the international organizations, such as the UN, that were supposed to maintain peace and security. And then finally, we have the rise of populism, even in established democracies here in the United States, but elsewhere in Europe and around the globe. And we add to all of this climate change, an existential threat that is mounting and will lead to even greater challenges in the future. So the questions I want to address are, how did we get here, and where are we going from here? But I want to begin with a short digression, and that is to make the point that peace and security, war and peace, ultimately depend on the relations among the great powers. In an anarchic world in which there is no one country enjoys a monopoly of power, where there is no recognized supreme authority to regulate the relations among states, security is a matter of self-help. And great powers use what they can in order to build the types of relations, create the types of conditions that bolster their own security. The problem is that doing that generally is perceived by other great powers as a threat to themselves. And so major war is always a possibility. And what prevents that, and what has prevented that throughout history, is an element of restraint in great power competition. Restraint that is grounded in a balance of power among the great powers, and in the shared concept of legitimacy. That is, a set of agreed rules on how you conduct yourselves on the global stage. Now, the last 50 years have illustrated both the promise of restraint and the problems of the lack of restraint. And we can divide these 50 years into two periods. The last decades of the Cold War, from the middle of the 1970s to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the period after that, which has been a period of American unipolarity, of America's preeminence on the global stage. Now, when we think of the Cold War in the minds of most of us was this bitter, ideological, existential struggle between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And in its initial phases, it had many, many dangerous crises. None of you remember the crises around Berlin in the late 50s and the early 1960s, centered on the city that was divided among the Western powers and the Soviet Union at that time. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted and put the world on the cusp of a thermonuclear war. By 1997, however, both the Soviet Union and the United States saw a need to ease tension, to reduce the risk of thermonuclear war, to reduce the cost of the arms race that had been mounting between them, and also to give them time to focus on the very real domestic problems that each country was facing. And this led to an era of relaxation of tension, what we call détente at this point. And it was built on several pillars of restraint. The first and perhaps the most important were the nuclear arms control treaties that were signed between the United States and the Soviet Union. These treaties were to create a balance in the nuclear area to create an element of restraint. And what these nuclear treaties did was ensure that neither country could develop superiority in the nuclear field. They were grounded in the idea that if you could create a situation in which a country had a reliable second strike capability, that is the ability to respond with a devastating strike in response to a first strike by the other power, then the incentive to strike first would be eliminated. That this fear of a second strike would deter leaders from even considering launching a nuclear war. So what they said at that time is, if you struck first, you died second. And that would create an element of restraint and stability in a nuclear realm. The second pillar was an agreement between the United States and Russia on the principles of conduct between the two of them. The first, and perhaps the most important, was the recognition that there was no alternative to peaceful coexistence given the destructive power of nuclear weapons. A second principle was that the two countries agreed that they would not try to attain unilateral advantage at the expense of the other anywhere in the world. There was also an agreement not to interfere in the domestic affairs of the other country, and also an agreement to fulfill in good faith all the treaties to which they had become parties. And the final pillar was the Helsinki Accords, the 50th anniversary of which we will celebrate next year. In this agreement, the United States and the Soviet Union, along with 32 other European countries, plus Canada, agreed to a set of principles that would guide practice on the global stage. Things like the sovereign equality of states, agreement to avoid the use or the threat of use of force, self-determination of peoples, peaceful resolution of conflict, and so forth. The Helsinki Accords also codified the historical, or the territorial settlement of the Second World War, explicitly, or not explicitly, but implicitly recognizing a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and the division of the division of Germany into two separate states. And it's this nuclear balance and the stability that grew out of the principles of U.S.-Russian relations and the Helsinki Accords that helped stabilize the situation in Europe, which was the central battlefield of the Second World War. Now, that didn't eliminate competition or conflict entirely from U.S.-Russian relations, but it shifted the focus away from the region where it would have had the most devastating consequences to other parts of the world. What we called in the 1970s and the 1980s the Third World, what we would call the Global South today. Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in numerous so-called proxy wars in that part of the world, while assiduously trying to avoid direct military confrontation between the two of them. Now, this was good for the United States and Russia. It was good for Europe, but obviously it had different consequences for the Global South at that point, which becomes part of the background for what we're seeing today in global affairs. Now, this period of restraint broke down with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. That left the United States as the sole superpower on the global stage. And it was a heavy time for anybody who was dealing with foreign policy in the United States at that point. The titanic ideological struggle of the 20th century among fascism, communism, and liberal democracy had been resolved in favor of liberal democracy. Fascism had been crushed during the Second World War, and at the end of the Cold War, Soviet communism had been eliminated as a significant factor on the global stage. That left liberal Western democracy as the organizing principle for global affairs. An American political scientist coined the phrase "end of history" at that point. And by that, what he meant was that for a country to survive and thrive in the 21st century, they would have to adapt the practices and policies of free market democracy, the paradigm of which was the United States. And so the United States, beginning in 1991 and throughout that decade, sought to expand its power and authority, sought to expand the benefits of liberal Western democracy around the globe. And it did that not only because it wanted to be beneficent and altruistic, but it also did that because it thought that it would undergird America's primacy well into the 21st century. And so the promotion of democracy and human rights becomes a central plank in American foreign policy. The United States at that time uses its power to protect and defend, to enforce the rules of a U.S.-led liberal international order. Many of the rules, in fact, formulated by the United States in close conjunction with its few allies at that point. And this, in fact, defined the period of the 1990s, and in many ways was unrestrained. It was unrestrained behavior in the United States, in part because it didn't face another great power competitor on the global stage. The Soviet Union had disappeared, and China and its economic rise were still sometime in the future. Now, by 2000, I think the situation begins to change a little bit. We begin to see the downsides of the unipolar world and the types of policies that the United States was promoting. Globalization was supposed to spread tremendous benefits across the globe, and to some extent it did. If you look at the number of people living below the internationally recognized poverty level, that number decreased by over 1 billion people from 1991 up to today. But the 2000s also revealed that globalization had a dark side. And that dark side was manifested in the rise of international terrorism, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the emergence of transnational crime organizations, and it also had domestic consequences, particularly in mature industrial countries like the United States. where you saw this tremendous loss of manufacturing jobs inside the country as capital and investment moved abroad to take advantage of more propitious or favorable economic circumstances from the standpoint of big international companies. So, by the beginning of the last decade, as a response to the downsides of globalization, to the downsides of some of the America's policies in the world, we saw the reemergence of great power competition. Russia tried to reassert its role on the global stage, not only in Europe, but farther afield. We saw the tremendous and unprecedented rise of China. We also began to see I would call the negative impacts of globalization and the reactions that you saw in established democracies, the rise of populism here in the United States, for example, that began to challenge the fundamental structures and institutions of liberal democracy inside the United States. And that, I think, is where we are today. The reemergence of great power competition, questions about the value of liberal democracy as a governing tool, not only in many countries that were and remain democracies, but more so as a set of ideas and values that should govern the international environment. And so we reach this period of transition in which we are in today. Now, the organizers here asked me to talk about the next 50 years in global affairs. You have to be foolhardy to want to predict what the world is going to look like 50 years from now. There's so much that can change in the global environment during the 50 years. What we know is that we've entered a period of extreme turbulence, and that the world in 2075 is going to look radically different from the world that we see around us today. The great truth that we all need to remember is that nothing lasts forever. Nothing lasts forever. So how confident can we be that such fixtures of the international scene today, the United Nations, NATO, the European project, the European Union, are going to still exist in 10 to 15 years from now, let alone in 2075? How confident can we be that the global hierarchy of power today is going to continue unchanged over the next 50 years? How confident can we be that there's not going to be a technological innovation that is radically going to redefine what power is and thereby redefine and restructure the global hierarchy of power? And then we have the problem of climate change. We've all focused on the existential threat. Are we likely to see, ultimately, the emergence of a grand international coalition that puts all these geopolitical problems that we're focused on today behind itself to focus on the existential challenge that climate change poses to the entire globe? Short answer is we don't know. What we do know is that in geopolitical terms, the landscape today is shifting very dramatically. Attention, and most attention, is focused on China, and with very good reason. The rise of China has been unprecedented in world history. Just a few factoids. In 1990, the United States economy was roughly 6 times the size of the Chinese economy in purchasing power parity terms. In 2016, the economies were the same size. Today, the Chinese economy ranks first in the world, and it's 20% larger than the American economy. If you look at investment in research and development, the basis for innovation in the world today. In 2000, China accounted for about 5% of global R&D. Today, it accounts for nearly a quarter. During that same period, the U.S. share of global R&D has fallen from 40% to just over 30%. If you look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, you see a large, very ambitious global infrastructure project to reshape the global environment. We know that this project, it has its problems, but it's certainly raised the profile and the prestige of China throughout the world, particularly in the global south. And so it's not without reason that the United States sees China today as the sole strategic competitor on the global stage. A country that, in the view of the U.S. government, has both the intention and the capability to shape the global environment going forward, and increasingly has the military, technological, diplomatic, and economic capabilities to do that successfully. Now, it's not only China. We've also seen, over the past several years, the emergence of a number of very important middle powers. Middle powers that in many ways are more aggressively pursuing their own national interests, and many times in contradiction to U.S. goals on the global stage. Think of India, for example. Today, the most populous country in the world, the major country whose economy is growing most rapidly, but clearly a country that has interests that are somewhat divergent with the United States, even though we share some fundamental democratic values. Think of the way India has operated with regard to Ukraine, for example, refusing to sign on to America's policy towards that conflict and towards Russia. Another example, think of Turkey, a NATO ally, to be sure, but a country that is increasingly pursuing its own independent course in its own neighborhood in the Middle East, in the Caucasus, and somewhat farther afield. But think of Iran, another major regional power that is on the cusp of developing its own nuclear weapons, and it clearly has ambitions to extend its sway throughout the broader Middle East. But think about North Korea, a minor power in the minds of many, but yet a country that has its own nuclear capability and is raising concerns at this very moment about whether it intends to use those for purposes of foreign policy or not. So we've seen the emergence of a whole range of middle powers, and that number will grow in the years ahead, and it will create additional complexities as we try to develop a stable world order. Final point here is that we've also seen with this change, this emergence of middle powers, great power competition, more broadly a diffusion of power around the globe. And this, I think, undermines or complicates the problem of global governance. The United Nations is losing some of its influence and authority because it has problems dealing in a world in which power is more diffused. Think of the UN Security Council, a body that was set up at the very end of the Second World War in a way that reflected the balance of power at that time, that created 5 permanent veto-wielding seats on the Council at that point: China, the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. For years, people have recognized that those 5 countries don't have the same weight in global affairs as they did before. Things have shifted. And there's been an effort to try to reform the UN Security Council, something that's ongoing, and yet it's very difficult to get a reform of the UN Security Council when those 5 veto-wielding powers actually have to agree to reform, and they're loath to give up the power that they have at this point. Look at the role of the G7. 30 years ago, the G7, this group of industrial democracy, major industrial democracies, accounted for over 40% of global GDP. Today, that figure is under 30%. And the BRICS, which is developing as something of an international financial institution, represents a greater share of the global GDP than a G7 do at this point. So the diffusion of power has also begun to change the global environment. Now, the other thing that we have to think of is not only a geopolitical change, but the rapid change and advance in technology, which is also having dramatic impact on the way we live, on the way we work, on the way we communicate, on the way we relax, and the way we fight. And this technological advance has been almost unprecedented in global history. Think of the internet, which is pervasive today. The internet began as a small network of a few academic research institutions and some military centers in the United States in the 1960s. 1990 marks the beginning of what we know today as the World Wide Net. In 1995, there were 16 million users of the internet. Today that figure is 5.5 billion, roughly 70% of the global population. And all this has occurred, this rapid change, in the course of about 30 years. Think about the social media that plays such a central role in the lives of many of you, I would suppose. 20 years ago, there was no Facebook. There was no X, formerly known as Twitter. There was no Reddit. There was no Instagram. All that has developed and become central to the lives of many of us in just the past couple of decades. And it's not only the internet. Think of nanotechnologies that are developing all sorts of different types of materials that are reshaping the way we build and construct. Think of bioengineering, which is doing wonders for human health, lengthening human life, is increasing agricultural production, energy sustainability. And the thing we're all talking about today, artificial intelligence, and the role that is playing in the way we deal with many of our economic problems today, and is at the cusp of a dramatic expansion in the role that it's going to play in the lives of most of us in the years ahead. This technology clearly has tremendous promise, but it also brings risks and perils. And it does bring those risks and perils to the stability of the global environment, and will have implications for world order going forward. I want to point out just two. The first concerns the nation state, which has been the fundamental building block of the global system since the Peace of Westphalia ended the 30-year War in 1648. The system has been built on the recognition of sovereign nation states that have the right to control the activities, political, socioeconomic, on their own territory without undue interference from other states. Today, the domination of the state on the global stage is being challenged. It's being challenged by the advance of technology. Think about financial institutions or global finances. Global finances now have very much a international, transnational aspect to them. You can move money across borders in an instant with a click on a computer screen. And yet the regulation of financial activities still remains on the level of the nation state. And they're overwhelmed by these very rapid flows of finances, and that can have a destabilizing impact on the economies of even major countries on the global stage. Think also about the role of big tech in the world today. An increasingly important element in the global economy, and yet an industry or a sector that doesn't necessarily listen to the nation state. It also has a role to play in the global environment that is an autonomous one, and one whose full impact we still fully don't understand. So technology and technological advance is posing a challenge to the fundamental building block of the global order. The second way in which it impacts on world order is that technology is undermining the restraint. And it's undermining restraint in the strategic area. The United States and the Soviet Union, over 50 years ago, began the construction of a bilateral strategic architecture that maintains strategic stability. I've already talked about the various nuclear arms control treaties. All of those treaties are now under question. Many of them have already been removed. The last remaining bilateral treaty between the United States and Russia, the New START treaty, is set to expire in 2026, and almost certainly will expire in 2026. And at the same time, this strategic landscape is changing in dramatic ways because of the advance of technology, which allows increasing numbers of states to play at the strategic level and creates the types of weapon systems that haven't been encompassed by earlier arms control agreements. So think about China. You can't do strategic stability, nuclear arms control, without China today. Iran and North Korea also have nuclear arms ambitions, and they will begin to impact on stability, certainly within their own region. And if the United States moves into a more isolationist mode, something that's possible over the next several years, you will see a loss or diminution in the confidence of America's extended deterrent. That is, our willingness to use our nuclear power to defend the safety and security of our allies. And that almost certainly will lead to countries like Japan and South Korea to consider developing their own nuclear arsenals. But it's not only the nuclear realm. The proliferation of weapons technologies, the development of cyberspace, a new domain of conflict, has also increased the range of states that engage on the strategic level. And what we're seeing now is the emergence of arms races, certainly in cyberspace. We're also seeing it in space itself, and we're also seeing it in the development of hypersonics. So restraint has been undermined by the advance of technology. Now, there's one other aspect of technology that also has an impact on world order going forward. And this really falls more into the realm of philosophy and ethics. And that is, the advances in technology are really raising the fundamental question of what it means to be a human being. Bioengineering creates the possibility of making humans to order. We have artificial intelligence that is emerging as a different type of intelligence, perhaps even superior to human intelligence. And all of this raises the question of where we fit in to the world and what impact we're going to have on the world going forward. Final element here is that all of these questions now have or touch upon the value systems that serve as the foundations for our own societies. And what we're seeing with the breakdown of the U.S.-led international order is that there are a number of other value systems around the world that could serve as a foundation, if not of a global order, then certainly of a regional order. Chinese Confucianism, for example, Indian Hinduism, Islam are all examples. And so one of the challenges we'll have going forward is reconciling these different sets of values to create a shared concept of legitimacy that can act to restrain competition on the global stage. Now, if we're looking for a precedent history that will help guide us through this very difficult period, my recommendation would be to look back to the late 19th and early 20th century, also a period of unprecedented and rapid change in global history. On the geopolitical side, it was the rise of Germany that was challenging the global hegemon at that period. Great Britain, the United States was a much potentially more powerful, certainly already a wealthier country that was waiting in the wings. The achievements of the Industrial Revolution were changing in radical fashion the way the world lived, the way it worked, the way it communicated, the way it relaxed, and the way that it thought. And the technology of that time was also beginning to impact on the way we thought about the human experience. Technological advance posed a fundamental challenge to what was then the dominant way of looking at the world, which was the religious one, in favor of a more secular view of the affairs. And that has continued and built during the 20th century. Now, what we know when we look back at history is all the technological advance, the wonders of the Industrial Revolution, laid the foundation for growing prosperity in the 20th century, certainly in its later decades. But the geopolitical changes, the technological advances, also led to the development of the weaponry and the murderous ideologies that made the 20th century the bloodiest in history. And so the challenge that we face today is not unlike the challenge that the world faced in the early 20th century. And that is, how do we develop the promise of this technology and this technological advance while avoiding the cataclysmic war that could set everything back in a radical fashion? That really is the question, I think, that we need to focus on today. And that's the challenge, I think, for all of you as you emerge in positions of greater authority and leadership on the global stage. Now, I think when you look at the situation today, there's a lot of focus in the commentary on the downsides, on the negatives. I know we're all worried about climate change and what that will mean for the globe 5, 10, 15 years from now, not to speak of 50 years from now. There's a grave concern in many parts of the world as to whether your generation will live better than your parents' generation or grandparents' generation. What I would argue is that this is also an area of a time of great promise. And it should be an inspiration to all of you. If you get the key trends right, if you can think creatively about how to develop technology, how to develop elements of restraint, how to avoid that cataclysmic war, you have the possibility of building a world order that will define the global environment for the rest of this century, if not longer. It's a tremendous opportunity. It's something that all of you can engage in. And as I see you here participating in this model UN, debating the very central problems of war and peace, of global development going forward, I think all of you at least have that in your mind as you think forward. And the only thing I can do at this point is encourage you to seniors, I hope you will, a much brighter future than perhaps the one that my generation has left you. Let me stop there. We have time for questions? Or are we done? I do. You want to come up here? You done?
So, before we kind of see a trend that democracy and peace and all that is going to work since the foundation of the UN and the end of Second World War. And we see that because countries have become so powerful, as you said, they are restraining themselves from using like powerful nuclear weapons. However, the current Russian-Ukraine war is so sudden that many of us didn't even have this sense that it's coming. So how do we predict such sudden conflicts between big nations?
That is a good question and something I know a lot of people in the U.S. government like to know the answer to. I mean, you know, the short answer to that question is you can't predict with any degree of accuracy as to when a conflict will emerge. What you can try to understand is the developments that are increasing tension in the global environment. You can develop the capacity to what we call strategic empathy, that is understanding how another country looks at the global stage, how it understands the policies and actions that your own country might be pursuing, and seeing whether your own actions are putting the two countries onto a collision course. And then if you come to the conclusion that they are, to see how policies can shift so that you can begin to nudge another power in a more favorable direction, again, without jeopardizing the achievement of your own long-term national interests. That is certainly something we hope that the United States and China are doing today as the tensions in East Asia begin to mount. It's something that one wishes the United States and Russia had done 5 or 10 years ago. And perhaps if that had happened, we wouldn't see the brutal conflict in Ukraine that we're seeing today. So, I mean, the short answer to your question is it takes a lot of study, it takes strategic empathy, and it takes a willingness to adjust your own policies in order to try to encourage restraint on the other side going forward. Do we have to use, or is there a microphone?
I think we have to use it.
Okay.
So the United Nations is reaching basically its 80-year mark, and I'm sure you've heard of the 80-year theorem or the Strauss-Howe theorem, which basically states that at the end of every 80 years, there's a new world order with the 4 generations. So I just wanted to ask, do you think in the next few years we're going to see a surge in more independent nations that sort of go against global governance and go against IGOs and NGOs and sort of establish their own rules and world orders, as we see with China, for example, attempting to establish its own bloc in the East?
Again, another good question. I think that is sort of the direct trajectory that we're on at this point. You know, the United Nations still has I think, a large role to play. You know, if not in the UN Security Council, where action has been paralyzed by the divisions among the great powers, particularly the United States, Britain and France on one side, China and Russia on the other. But as you know, there are a host of affiliated organizations that play important roles and continually important roles in health, development, and other things. And my guess is that those will continue to some extent. But the central sort of element, the ones that I think big powers believe impact most on power and their economic capabilities, those will come under challenge. You certainly see that with China and a number of other countries. The BRICS is an example of an institution that is meant in many ways to act as a counterbalance to those Bretton Woods institutions that were developed at the end of the Second World War. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, another one that has provided security in Eurasia in ways that will not necessitate turning to the United Nations for anything in particular. Now, whether we'll see this develop elsewhere in the world, I think, is an open question, because you have to be a country with sufficient economic wherewithal and a presence on the global stage to do that. Where might another country emerge? It's hard to say at this point. 10, 15, 20 years down the road, another matter. Where will India wind up, for example? So yes, I mean, there is going to be that challenge. And as I said in my remarks, one of the things that will, I think, test the capabilities of world leaders going forward is whether you can begin to develop a world order, a common world order, out of what is likely to be a world of smaller regional orders in the years ahead. So there was an American political scientist many years ago, at the end of the Cold War, who wrote a very influential article at that point called The Clash of Civilizations, and argued that the primary battles and confrontations wouldn't be between states anymore, but civilizations. Like China's civilization, Orthodox civilization centered on Russia, Islam, and so forth. That may not be exactly right, but the idea that we're getting regional orders that operate on different sets of values, I think, is something that we're going to face. And as I said, the challenge is, can you reconcile this to produce an overarching world order that is conducive to peace and stability across the globe? Down here?
So Chinese foreign policy has historically been based on economics and trade. And so recently, with their encroachment into the Middle East and US's influence, especially on Saudi Arabia, how far does that economic leverage go, especially with the recent brokering of the Iran-Saudi deal?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that China's interests now have expanded beyond simply economics. Economics and economic development has provided the basis, and I think the Chinese would also argue the necessity that they play a larger role in global security. After all, you want to secure your investments overseas, and if nothing else, China has a significant amount of investment in Africa, the Middle East, in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and so forth. So it's not to be unexpected that they are playing a larger role geopolitically and on the security realm. Now, what this means for the Middle East is an open question at this point. On the one hand, as you pointed out, you saw the Chinese play a role in this reconciliation, if that's the appropriate word, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which indicates sort of growing influence in the region. But it's also curious that in the present conflict, the Chinese aren't playing much of a role at all. That the major outside power is the United States. And I think that is because the fundamental question at this point is really the security question. And of all the major powers, the United States is the one best positioned to play in the security realm. The Chinese simply don't have the capabilities to do that at this point, and don't enjoy the type of reputation among the key actors in the region to be influential that way. And that all could change 5, 10, 15 years from now. But at this point, China is just in the initial phases of expanding its security influence. Okay, now to take someone in the back right here. I don't know how far back we can go. You're as far back as you can go, so you can come up.
So during your speech, you speak a lot about how this process of globalism has a lot of downsides. And obviously one of the downsides, I think you may have mentioned, was like the loss of cultures, etc. For example, I can think of immediately the Oss language, which was lost just a few weeks ago. And it was based in, I believe, southern Siberia. It only had a couple of speakers left by the time that it got covered. So is there especially like a way for countries around the world to maintain this cultural diversity of the world? And if not, is it really just some kind of trend of globalization that cultures will die in the first place?
Now, remember, as I said, nothing lasts forever, but we like some cultures obviously to last longer than the near term. Look, I mean, I think what you're seeing now is a reaction to globalization. Globalization, as I said, did produce a lot of global benefits, but there are downsides. And one of the downsides was the pressure that it put on certain cultures around the world. And what you're seeing now is an effort, particularly in the countries of the global south, to reassert themselves in order to bolster their cultures, to regain some of that. What you see on the global stage now, this reclaiming of cultural treasures that have been taken by imperialism and moved to museums in Europe and in the United States. A major effort now to bring those back home, again, to fortify and rebuild the culture. So I think what you're going to see, certainly in the near term, is a mounting effort to do that, and an increasing, I think, willingness or understanding in the formal imperial world that this is in fact an appropriate thing to do. Yes, there's a challenge, but I think the near term is going to see actually a movement in the other direction. Thank you very much.